She was not the one they had been watching. That was the truth the keep had carried for 23 years. The bond belonged to another line, a grander line, a line with standing. When the Alpha King's mate recognition had failed to land at the solstice ball of the year 1147, the council had simply recorded it as an anomaly, sealed the register, and waited. The king had waited too, still and patient as stone, watching each new season bring a new candidate. None of them had been the one. The watching became a kind of legend. The failing became a kind of wound. And Sarah Voss, who carried grain sacks through the lower corridors of Veldrath Keep every morning before the hall fires were lit, had never been watched at all. She was not supposed to be there when it happened. The Alpha King's bond had skipped a generation. So the elders said. So the registers confirmed. It had passed over his mother's line and his father's sister's line, and 17 women presented at the Claiming Moon across 4 border territories. It had passed over them all. What no register had noted, what Sarah did not know until the moment it was too late to step aside, was that it had not skipped. It had been waiting. And the generation it had been waiting for was standing in a corridor with her arms full of barley, wearing a headscarf over hair she had not washed in 4 days, the morning the king turned the corner and stopped walking. The year was 1147 on the stone calendar of the north. The ashfall moon was 3 nights past. The grain corridor of Veldrath Keep smelled of cold stone and dried hops and the oil they used on the cellar doors. Sarah was 19, a ward of the keep's household stores, daughter of a cartwright who had died in the border raids when she was 12, living on the sufferance of Steward Aldrich and his recorded grace. She had no pack rank. She carried no bond mark. She had not yet shifted into her wolf, and at 19, the whisper in the lower hall was that she likely never would. She did not hear the Alpha King before she saw him. No footstep announced him. The air simply changed. Steward Aldrich found her in the corridor 30 seconds later, dropped to one knee with the barley spread across the stone around her, her face gone entirely white. He looked between her and the still form of King Cale Duren in the passage ahead, and his expression did not name the thing he understood. Instead, he said, "Get up. You are blocking the provision route." Cale Duren had not moved. He was watching her with an attention that had no category she recognized. "My lord," she managed, and gathered the barley and did not look up. "If you have ever wanted to watch a hierarchy be utterly wrong about who mattered, stay close. What unfolds from this corridor will not leave the keep's register for another century." Steward Aldrich had served Veldrath for 18 years. He was a methodical man who recorded everything in columns and kept his columns clean, and he did not like disruptions to the provision route. He had watched 4 bond presentations fail in the upper hall, each time a young woman of standing brought before the king in ceremonial dress, the council watching, the bond refusing to fire. Each time, Aldrich had noted the failure and filed it. The lack of urgency in his noting said everything about who he believed the bond would favor when it finally arrived. It would not favor a grain carrier with no wolf and a dead cartwright for a father. It would favor someone with a name in the registries, someone the council had put there. Sarah did not think about the bond. She thought about the barley and whether the south cellars would be short again before the ashfall accounts were settled, and whether Elda Warren, the storage mistress who had taught her to count grain and read provision marks when she was 13, would be able to stand tomorrow. Elda's knee had been swollen for a week. Sarah had been packing it in cold river clay each evening and watching the old woman pretend she was not grateful. The Alpha King appeared in the corridor again the next morning. She was counting sacks by the cellar door. She heard the air change before she heard his steps, and she straightened slowly, her hands full of the rope she had been using to tally. Cale Duren was tall and dark-haired, with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye toward the jaw and an old break in his nose that had healed slightly left of center. He was not what the court paintings made him. The court paintings showed a severe and beautiful profile. What stood in the cellar doorway was a man who looked as though the throne had cost him something, who wore a traveling cloak and no crown this morning, and who was looking at her with an expression she could not read. "You work this corridor every morning," he said. "Yes, my lord." "Before the hall fires. The count takes longer if there is foot traffic." He looked at the rope in her hands. He did not ask why she used a rope instead of a ledger. He said, "Does the steward know the south cellar short count is deliberate?" Her hands stopped. She had not reported the short count. She had found it 3 weeks ago, a small and careful bleed of grain from the south stores, recorded as spoilage in Aldrich's columns. Too consistent a spoilage pattern to be spoilage. She had said nothing, because she was not certain what it meant yet, and because what she had found belonged to Aldrich's accounts. She had no standing to challenge Aldrich's accounts. "I do not know what you mean," she said. Cale Durin's jaw moved once. "No," he said. "I think you do." He left. She stood in the cellar doorway with the rope in her hands and the cold coming up through the flagstones, and understood that she had just been seen by the most dangerous person in the keep, for knowing something she had not meant to be caught knowing. Elda Warren was waiting for her in the storage room with the clay already prepared, and Sarah did not tell her about the corridor. She told her 3 days later, when it became necessary. She did not tell Elda about the king. She said only that she had found an irregularity in the south cellar accounts and was not sure what to do with it. Elda, who had been counting grain at Veldrath since before Steward Aldrich was appointed, was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Child, leave it alone. It is not spoilage. I know it is not spoilage." "Then who?" Elda looked at the river clay on her hands. "The steward records what the steward records," she said. "The south cellar has been short in the same pattern for 4 years. Nobody who had the standing to question it has questioned it." She paused. "You do not have the standing. Someone is bleeding the keep's winter stores." "Someone with a column in the ledger is bleeding the keep's winter stores," Elda said. "There is a difference. Put it down." Sarah did not put it down. She was not built for putting things down. She went back to the south cellar that night with a candle and counted again, and what she found was not only the bleed in the grain, but a second notation buried in the lining of the false shelf behind the east wall. A notation in a different hand. Older, dated 7 years back, that described an arrangement between Aldrich and a buyer outside the border territory. The arrangement named quantities. It named seasons. It named a sum. She was still crouched behind the false shelf with the candle when the footsteps sounded in the doorway. She did not drop the candle. She turned, and King Cale Duren was standing in the cellar entrance with no guard and an expression that had moved from unreadable into something closer to recognition. "You went looking," he said. "I found something." "I know what you found. I have been looking for that notation for 3 years." He stepped into the cellar. "How did you know about the false shelf?" "Elda Warren showed me every storage space in this keep when I was 13, she said. "I know where the spaces are that the ledger doesn't count." He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the shelf, crouched beside her, and looked at the notation in the candlelight. He was close enough that she could feel the heat from his side, a warmth in the cold cellar air that she had no name for, not temperature, not comfort, something older than either. Her hands did not shake. She was proud of that later. "You knew this was Aldrich's hand," Cale said. "I compared it to the provision ledger." "And you said nothing." "I had nothing to say it with. I have no standing to challenge a steward's accounts." Cale looked at the notation again. Then he said, "You have standing now." He stood, and she stood, and the distance between them in the cellar was exactly the distance of people who were trying very hard not to acknowledge what the air between them was doing. She could feel it as a pressure, not threat, not warmth, something that hummed below both. Her wolf, the wolf she had not yet found, went entirely still inside her. Not in the way of fear. In the way of a held breath before something enormous lands. She excused herself. She walked the full length of the cellar corridor before her legs decided they were not entirely reliable. Aldrich moved against her 4 days later. She had known he would. She had found his evidence, and even if she had not reported it, he had seen her in the cellar. Aldrich was a methodical man, and methodical men did not leave known liabilities walking around the provision route. He went to the council record and noted that a ward of the household stores had been found accessing restricted ledger documents. He did not say why she had been in the ledger space. He said she had been found without authorization. He requested her transfer to the outer labor yards, where wards without pack rank were typically reassigned when their usefulness to the stores became uncertain. The council approved it in the morning session. Sarah was informed by a junior clerk who could not quite meet her eye. She went to Elda first. Elda Warren sat in the storage room with her clay-packed knee and looked at Sarah's face and said, "How long?" 3 days grace to settle accounts. Then we have 3 days. Elda reached under the low table where she kept her knee wrappings and produced a small, sealed tube of tin, the kind provision keepers used for sensitive correspondence. "I have been waiting for a reason to open this for 4 years," she said. "I found something in the east cellar before you did, before you were old enough to go looking." She pressed the tube into Sarah's hands. "I did not have the standing to use it either. You do not yet. But you will, or I have been very badly wrong about what that king is doing in this keep's grain corridors." The tube contained a second set of accounts. Aldrich's real accounts, the accounts he kept for the buyer outside the border, going back 11 years. It contained names. It contained dates. And at the bottom of the last page, in a notation that had been added recently, within the last season, Sarah judged by the ink, it contained a single line that noted the arrangement's intended end. When the king's bond failure was formalized at the next claiming moon, the steward would become the administrative authority of the Northern Territory. The bond's failure was not expected. It was planned. She stood in the storage room with the tin tube in her hands and understood that the South Cellar's short count was the smallest piece of what Aldrich had been building. There are moments when a person sees the full shape of a trap for the first time, and the shape is so much larger than expected that the fear comes second, behind the clarity. Sarah felt the clarity first. She went to find the Alpha King. Finding him was easier than it should have been. She did not have to ask where he was. She walked toward the north corridor and her feet knew the direction, and she thought about that only briefly before she stopped thinking about it and walked faster. He was in the upper record room with his second, a compact, careful man named Bren, who had the stillness of someone who had learned to be unnoticeable by choice. They were looking at a set of ledger sheets when she appeared in the doorway, and Cale looked up from the ledgers before she made a sound. "The bond failure at the claiming moon was designed," she said. "Aldrich has been managing the presentations. He controls the registration of candidates. He has been ensuring that every woman brought before you for bond recognition has been pre-selected from lines he can confirm carry no resonance. He has been choosing women he knew the bond would pass over." She held out the tin tube. 11 years of accounts, his hand, his buyer, his notation about the administrative succession. Bren took the tube. He looked at Cale. Cale did not look at Bren. He was looking at Sarah, with an expression that had moved entirely past unreadable into something the narrator will not name because he did not name it. Not yet. Not in that room. He said, "How long have you had this?" "Elda Warren kept it 4 years. She gave it to me this morning." "Because of the transfer order?" "Yes." "He moved against you to remove the liability." Cale's jaw set. "He did not know you had already given me the shelf notation." "I had not given you anything. You found me." "I had been watching the cellar corridor for 3 weeks," he said. "I knew the bleed was deliberate. I knew someone in the lower staff had found it. I did not know it was you until the morning I turned the corner. He paused. He looked at the tube in Bren's hands. Cancel the transfer order, he said to Bren. Bren left. The room was very quiet. You should know, Sarah said, that I am not doing this because of the corridor, or whatever the corridor was. I am doing this because someone has been stealing this Keep's winter stores for 11 years, and the people who suffer for that are not the people in the record room. They are the families in the outer settlements who come up short in the cold months and do not know why. I know, Cale said. I want to be clear that I am not presenting you with evidence because I want something from it. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. That is the problem. She did not know what he meant. She found out 17 days later when Aldrich made his second move. The second move was not subtle. Aldrich had a cousin on the outer council, and through that cousin he filed a formal challenge to the king's bond record, not to the king's authority, but to the validity of the claiming moon process itself. He argued that the process had been corrupted by the king's irregular behavior in the lower keep, and that a re-presentation of candidates should be required before any administrative changes were enacted. The challenge was designed to forestall Cale from acting on the accounts until the council had convened, reviewed, and deliberated. Deliberation, under Northern law, required a minimum of 40 days. 40 days was enough time for Aldrich's buyer outside the border to send the force he had been promised. Bren brought Sarah the news in the grain cellar, which she had continued working because no one had formally canceled her duties along with the transfer order. She was counting again, rope in hand, when Bren appeared and told her about the 40-day window. He does not need 40 days, she said. He needs one. The border force is already moving. We have confirmed that. Bren's expression was careful. The king is deliberating the response. The question is whether to move against Aldrich before the council challenge is formally lodged, which carries its own risk, or wait and move after, which allows the 40-day window. He cannot wait, she said. Sarah. Bren looked at her. You know this complicates the situation with the bond. I know. She set the rope down. Whatever the corridor was, it is not the question right now. The question is that a man has been planning the slow collapse of this territory for 11 years, and the evidence to stop him is sitting in a tin tube in the upper record room. He will argue the evidence was obtained by an unauthorized ward. Then the king needs a second source. She thought for a moment. Elda Warren has been in this keep's stores for 30 years. She is not a ward. She is a provision keeper of record. If she testifies to the pattern she observed over 4 years before I arrived, she provides a source the council cannot dismiss as unauthorized. She looked at Bren. Is she safe? For now, Aldrich's attention is on the council challenge. Then I need to talk to Elda. Elda Warren came to the council session on the morning of the 39th day, her knee wrapped and her provision record under her arm, and she testified for 2 hours in the flat, precise voice of a woman who had been keeping columns for 30 years. She named dates. She named quantities. She named the pattern of shortage across 11 winters. She named the false spoilage notation and the East Shelf document and the tin tube she had kept in the storage room. She did not embellish. She did not pause to see how the council was receiving her. She simply stated what she had observed and what she had recorded, and when she finished, she folded her hands on the table and waited. The council chamber was quiet for a long time after. Aldrich stood. He was composed and certain, in the way of a man who had been planning for a contingency and believes his plan is sound. He said, "The testimony of a household provision keeper is not equivalent to the testimony of a ranked council member. The source is unauthorized." He looked at Sarah, who was sitting beside Elda, because she had not been dismissed and she had not left. As is the evidence chain, both sources are wards or lower staff. The council has no obligation. The door at the far end of the chamber opened. The air changed before the door was fully open. Sarah felt it as a pressure drop, a sudden gravity in the room that she had felt twice before, in the grain corridor, in the cellar. The assembled council members felt it too. Two of the outer council seats went very still. Aldrich's cousin stood up halfway and then sat down. Cale Duran walked the length of the chamber without hurry. He was wearing the northern crown this time, the iron circlet with the inset gray stone, and he had his second guard flanking him at a distance, and the whole room rearranged itself around him the way rooms did when he moved through them. He did not look at Aldrich. He looked at the council chair at the head of the table and said, "We will hear the rest of the record." Aldrich said, "My lord, the challenge period requires." "The challenge period ended when your buyer's force crossed the border 4 days ago," Cale said. "You have been stalling. The council is aware of this. Sit down." Aldrich did not sit. He said, "The evidence against me was gathered by unauthorized personnel. Its validity cannot be confirmed without." "It was confirmed by me," Cale said. 3 weeks before the challenge was filed, I reviewed the South Cellar accounts myself. I verified the false spoilage pattern against the independent provision record kept by Elda Warren, whose record has been continuous for 30 years, and who holds a provision keeper's seal from this keep's own registry. The unauthorized designation you are arguing applies to a ward who identified the pattern and reported it to the person responsible for acting on it, which is not the ward, but the king. He paused. The evidence is valid. The source chain is valid. The accounts are the record, and the record is before this council. Aldrich's composure cracked then. Not entirely. Methodical men do not crack entirely. He said, "The ward's presence in the restricted ledger space was itself a violation of protocol. She had no authority to access those documents. She found them in a space not covered by the ledger," Cale said. "The false shelf behind the east wall of the south cellar does not appear in the restricted document inventory because the restricted document inventory was last recorded by you. You excluded it because you had placed documents there you did not want found." He looked at Aldrich steadily. "You have been managing the keep's records to conceal an 11-year arrangement to drain its winter stores and position yourself as administrative successor on the assumption that my bond would never fire." He let that sit for a moment. "Your assumption was wrong." Aldrich looked at Sarah. It was a long look. In it she read the realization of exactly when he had gone wrong, and the precise moment he understood that the grain carrier in the headscarf had not been a liability to be transferred out of the provision route. She had been the thing he had failed to account for, because he had never thought to account for her. "She is a ward with no wolf and no rank," Aldrich said. His voice had changed. The composure was still there, but it had gone hollow underneath. "She has no standing in this council or in this record." "She has my standing," Cale said. "And before this council and before this record, I am naming her to it." He turned to the council chair. "Record it." Aldrich moved then. He was not a man of violence, but the 4 years of careful planning and the 40-day window and the 2 moves that had failed and the buyer's border force that was already inside the territory's edge had left him with no remaining column to record anything in, and a man without a column will sometimes reach for the one thing left. He had a blade. He had kept it in his sleeve for exactly this kind of contingency, methodical to the last. He did not reach Sarah. Bren moved first from the doorway. Cale moved second, crossing the chamber floor in the time it took Aldrich to clear his sleeve. And the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was not a man who had held his throne for 11 years of careful planning against him by being slow. What happened was not prolonged. It was decisive and hard and final, and when it was over, Aldrich was on the council chamber floor, and the council was silent, and the outer council cousin was standing in the far corner looking at the wall. Cale turned to the council chair. "Record it," he said again. The council chair recorded it. The border force was met at the outer gate that afternoon by Bren and the King's Guard, 12 against 40, and the 12 held because Bren had known the gate terrain for 8 years, and the 40 had been planning for a negotiated handover rather than armed resistance. The buyer outside the border sent a letter 2 days later. The letter noted that the arrangement had been concluded and that his interest in the Northern Territory was formally withdrawn. The letter was filed in the council record. The column closed. The claiming moon came 3 days after that, and Sarah was in the grain cellar when it rose, because the South Cellar account still needed closing and she had not yet been assigned other work, and she did not know what to do with what had happened in the council chamber, or the fact that her wolf, the wolf that had not found her in 19 years, had been pressing against the inside of her ribs since the morning in the grain corridor and getting louder. Cale found her there. He had stopped looking surprised to find her in the cellar. He said, "You have been avoiding the upper hall." "I have been closing accounts." "Elda Warren closed the accounts yesterday." "There was a recount." "Sarah." He stopped near the cellar wall, his back to the cold stone, not crowding the distance between them. "The council has recorded your standing. You are not a ward of the household stores. You have not been a ward of the household stores since the morning I reviewed the accounts. I did not tell you, because you would have found a reason to argue that the standing was contingent on the investigation's outcome." He paused. "You would have been correct that it was contingent. It is not contingent now." She was looking at the rope in her hands. "I am still not the person they were watching," she said. "I know what happened in the corridor. I know what the air does when you are in it. I know it is not something I invented. I am not going to pretend I do not know." She looked up. "I am also not going to pretend that I know what it means for a bond to have skipped a generation and found something it was apparently waiting for in a grain corridor. It seems like the bond should have had better judgment." Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, exactly. It was what a man's face does when he has been alone for a very long time and something arrives that he did not think would come. "The bond did not skip a generation," he said. "I have been looking at the registration record since the investigation opened. Aldrich removed your family's line from the candidate registry 9 years ago. Your father was a Cartwright, but your mother was Border Pack, daughter of a provision master who held rank in the old Northern Registry before the consolidation. Aldrich was managing more than the grain accounts. He was managing the candidate pool." Cale moved, not quickly, from the wall to the space before her, and the distance collapsed to the distance of the cellar, which was close. "The bond did not skip. It was blocked. It found you the moment you were in the same corridor." She could feel his warmth from 3 feet away. She could feel her wolf pressed against her ribs like a fist. She said, "I want to be clear that I am not agreeing to anything because of an old registration that was falsified." "I know." "Or because of what happens to the air when you are in a room." "I know that too." "I am telling you that I need to understand what I am agreeing to and what it costs." He said, "It costs me my throne as it has been structured. The council expects a formal bond presentation. What happened in the grain corridor was not a formal bond presentation. If I name you through council record and not through ceremony, there are Northern lords who will challenge it. Some of them have already been in correspondence with Aldrich's buyer." He looked at her steadily. "I know what it costs. I am telling you anyway." He reached out slowly and his hand closed over hers, rope and all, and the wolf she had not found in 19 years arrived with a force that dropped her to one knee before she understood what was happening. Light came. It was not a polite or subtle light. It moved through the stone floor and up through her ribs and out through her hands, and it was gold, and it was warm, and it was not, she thought from the floor, what she had imagined a bonfire would look like, because she had not imagined it at all, and imagining had nothing to do with what this was. Cale went to one knee on the cellar floor beside her, not because the light had taken his legs, because he chose to. The provision corridor of Veldrath Keep had no witnesses, except the cold stone and the ashfall moon through the high cellar window, and one rope. Bren found them 20 minutes later when the light faded. He stood in the cellar doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them on the floor with the bond glow still warm on the stone around them, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the stone had not already recorded. The formal ceremony was held in the Great Hall on the Frost naming night, 7 weeks after the cellar. The lords who had been in correspondence with Aldrich's buyer attended because they had no legitimate ground to refuse a bonfire that half the keep's lower staff had witnessed through the cellar window, word of which had moved through Veldrath faster than any formal record. The outer council cousin stood in the far corner again and looked at his boots. Sarah stood on the dais in the working dress she had worn to the grain cellar, because Cale had told her she could wear whatever she chose, and she had chosen the thing that was hers. Elda Warren was in the front row with her knee wrapped and her provision record under her arm, because Sarah had asked her to be there. Bren stood at the hall door. The council chair read the bond record into the great register. He read Sarah's line, restored from the old registry, the provision master's blood, and the border pack standing, and the 23 years the record had been kept empty by a man who had needed the bond to keep failing. He read the date of the cellar. He read the date of the council chamber. He read Cale's notation, added in the king's own hand to the register 3 weeks prior, ward of the household stores, daughter of the Northern Provision Line, candidate for recognition since the year of her birth. 23 years the column had sat blank. The chair read it in full. Then he closed the register and looked at the hall, and said, "Does anyone hold a formal objection to the recording of this bond?" The hall was quiet. Even the lords from the Eastern Territories, who had legitimate standing to object and letters in their saddlebags that suggested they intended to, were quiet. A bonfire in a cellar floor, witnessed by 12 lower staff workers through a high window, tends to settle the question of legitimacy in a way that council challenges do not. Cale descended from the dais, not the half-step a king takes for ceremony. The full descent, down to the floor, crossing to the place where she stood at the dais edge, and he went to one knee on the flagstone in front of the assembled hall, and took both her hands in his and said nothing, because the thing that needed saying had already been said in the cellar, and a king's public kneel says more than words in any register. The hall went down, one by one, not all at once. That is not how it happens, in the north. The closest lords first, then the outer council, then the skeptical eastern lords. Slowly, one at a time, until the great hall of Veldrath had 200 people on their knees, and one woman standing in a working dress, holding a rope she had forgotten to put down. Elda Warren did not kneel. She was 64 and her knee was wrapped, and she was a provision keeper, not a subject. She watched from the front row with her arms folded and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was satisfied in the way of a person who has been keeping a tin tube for 4 years and has finally seen it put to its proper use. In the weeks that followed, the border accounts were audited from the first irregular year forward. The buyer outside the territory received a formal notice that his 11-year arrangement had been dissolved and that the Northern Territory was no longer available for acquisition. The council candidate registry was rebuilt from the old Northern records, all erased entries restored, all false spoilage notations corrected. The south cellar got a new shelf with a proper lock and a proper key, and the key went on Sarah's provision ring, which she kept, because Cale had told her she could keep whatever was hers, and the grain cellar was hers, in the way that places are hers when a person has counted them in the dark at 5 in the morning for 3 years and knows every stone. Elda Warren's knee improved. The river clay helped, but mostly what helped was that Sarah had arranged for the storage mistress's quarters to be moved to the ground floor in the southern wing, where the floor stones held heat from the keep fires, and the morning damp did not reach. Elda did not mention this. She simply appeared in her new quarters the morning they were ready, and set her provision record on the new table and her knee wrappings on the new shelf, and did not say a word about it, which was, as Sarah had come to understand, her way of saying everything. On the morning of the third ashfall moon after the cellar, Sarah walked the provision corridor before the hall fires were lit, out of habit more than duty. The rope was not in her hands. She had a proper ledger now. She stopped at the place in the corridor where the air had changed 18 months ago, and stood there for a moment in the cold quiet of the early keep, smelling cold stone and dried hops and the distant smoke of fires that had not yet caught. Cale was behind her. She had heard him before she felt the warmth. "You still count before dawn," he said. "Old habit. Elda has 3 junior provision keepers now. Elda does not trust junior provision keepers with the South Cellar recount. Neither do you." She turned. He was standing in the corridor in a traveling cloak, no crown this morning, looking exactly as he had looked 18 months ago when she had been holding grain sacks, and the air had changed, and she had not known what it meant. She knew what it meant now. She knew what it had meant then, too, if she was willing to say so. "I was not the one they were watching," she said. "I know. For 23 years the council was watching someone else." "They were watching the wrong column," he said. "Columns are only as good as the person who keeps them." She thought about that. She thought about Elda's tin tube and Aldrich's false shelf, and her own rope tally, and the long, cold patience of a bond that had been blocked for 23 years and had not, apparently, been deterred by it. She put the ledger under her arm and walked the corridor, and he walked beside her, and the keep woke up around them one by one in the ordinary way of mornings, and the South Cellar accounts were right on the first count. They were right on every count after that.